Hello to all my loyal listeners out there in YouTube land. I'm so happy to be in your homes once again. If you are a first-time listener, welcome. You've tuned into the Patriot Preacher. My name is Charles Wells, and I am the Patriot Preacher. So are you one of those folks who believe that government is the answer to most of the ailments that we have in our society? At one point in my life, I certainly thought so. As I pointed out in other videos I produced when I was younger, I thought politicians were somehow intellectually superior to me and had more knowledge and ultimately had my best interest in mind. But as time progressed and I got older and I also got wiser, I began to realize that not only did government not have all the answers, but the answers they actually provided was seldom in the best interest of our citizens. This couldn't be any truer than in the educational arena. The United States spends nearly $20,000 a year on average for each student in this country, which is significantly more than any other country in the world. Yet, our children are consistently slipping in the rankings of where they stand as compared to other students around the world. The Program for International Student Assessment assesses 15-year-old students around the world and is administered by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In 2018, when the last test was administered, the U.S. placed 11th out of 79 countries in science, and it did even far worse in math, ranking 30th out of 79. Now, why is this? The answer is really quite simple. The focus of our system is on the system itself and not on the students. The students have been almost completely forgotten in many cases throughout this great land, which is an incredible shame because education is the key to success on so many levels in our lives. I very much believe that student-focused education is the only way out of generational poverty. It is the way to break the curse and the chains of where we came from and where we were born into, separate and regardless of things like race and culture. A good education allows us to overcome circumstantial differences in our lives, especially for those who are economically disadvantaged, which, despite what you may have been led to believe by our illustrious press corps, affects all races. You see, people will live up or down to expectations of them. If you tell people they are victims, they have a tendency to fail. If they're told they are special, they will try to live up to that moniker. Many of you may remember the 1988 movie about Jamie Escalante, who was a high school teacher that successfully inspired his very dropout-prone students to not only learn calculus, but to outperform students from much more affluent schools. People who have enough money, of course, can simply pay to have their children attend private or charter schools of their choice. They can afford individual attention through the use of tutors, etc. It's been my observation over the years, as anecdotal as it may be, that homeschool children, for example, far exceed the knowledge level of their public educated peers because of the one-on-one attention they receive and their parents' desire to see their children succeed. The truth is that our public school system in most of our underprivileged areas has evolved, or more accurately, devolved into less of a place of learning and more of a place to simply keep children off the street. And they don't even do that very well, since much of what these children learn on the street is brought into the school. A very telling tale is that public school teachers themselves overwhelmingly prefer to send their own children to private schools if they can afford it, simply because they see up close and personal how the system for economically disadvantaged areas, and in many cases even middle-class schools, are, for lack of a better word, broken. So what are we doing wrong, and how can we fix it, you might ask at this point? Well, the answer to that question, while imperfect, is also astonishingly simple. It is school choice. Now, I'm sure most of you certainly at least have heard of school choice before. Sometimes it's represented in terms of a voucher program of some sort, where parents have the ability and flexibility to send their children wherever they please, as long as they are willing to give them the transportation to get there. Now, this issue has become a political football for many years, And with most conservatives firmly supporting school choice, and while most liberal Democrats opposing this liberty. In fact, many of you have probably already formed an opinion or based upon the things that you listen to or the news that you listen to. Here's the thing, folks. I worked in the federal government for more than 20 years. I subsequently worked for state government for 5 years. And there's one immutable truth that has emerged for me over the years, and that is government does very little well. And it does virtually nothing economically, efficiently, or in the best interest of the people it professes to serve. Now, why do I say this? Because, my brothers and sisters, government has no competition. They are the only game in town. If a monopoly in private enterprise is supposedly an evil thing, because the corporation that has the monopoly doesn't care about the people it serves, why is this no less true for government? Why? Because government is intrinsically more altruistic and caring than its corporate counterpart? No. People are people regardless of where they make their living, and human behavior reigns supreme. If there is no incentive for people to improve systems, then they won't, at least on a macro level. All you have to do is ask yourself, how often have you visited a Social Security office or went in to get your driver's license and it was a pleasant experience? The lines are long, people are treated like cattle, the customer service representatives are frequently abrupt, uninformative, and often borderline rude to the people they serve. The truth is, if you were consistently treated that way at Walmart, you would cease going there and choose, for example, to go to Target. You see, when it comes to purchasing goods and services, people vote with their feet and their dollars. What this does is force these companies who are in competition with each other for your money to improve their service and their product. If there were no competition, there would be no reason for these companies to be customer-oriented because you would be forced to take whatever service or product they gave you. This is no different with our educational system, folks. The reason we have such poorly performing schools is not a lack of money. We spend a lot of money on our schools, but a lack of incentive to do better because they have no competition. A lot of people say, well, this would cost a lot of money. No, it wouldn't. The fact is that most private schools spend less on each of their students than does government on public schools because private schools are in competition with one another. And therefore, they're going to provide a better service for less money than public schools. Then you have to ask yourself, if all this is true, then why are our democratic leaders so against school choice? The truth is that as organizations become larger and larger, they become more unwieldy and self-serving. In many states like California, teachers they're not forced to join unions, but they are forced to pay union dues. Union dues not only are mandatory, but are very expensive. And you have to ask, what's done with all this money that the unions collect? Well, very simply, they lobby the federal government for yet more money. Consider this. Since 1971, when I was 12, student enrollment in our schools has only increased by about 10%, while school employment, like teachers, principals, administrators, has increased 95%. In other words, the educational bureaucracy has burgeoned and grew dramatically, whereas much of our money has gone, while the students are receiving less of the very basic education that they need to succeed in this world. Now, at this point, I'm going to get a little sentimental. I enjoyed my childhood and I enjoyed school. I have very fond memories of very particular teachers who had a profound effect on me. The teachers of that era were incredible role models. They would notice if you were having a difficult time with a particular subject, for example, and have you stay after school to spend some time with them. They genuinely thought about and had close relationships with the children they educated. My third grade teacher was Mrs. Wright. I remember when we would have class and a high school student would come in and visit the class unexpectedly who previously had been a student of hers. She would introduce him to the class and as one of her previous students. Then years later, I found I was a high school student that came back and did the same thing. I visited her class and she introduced me to her new students. Then there was Mr. Stanton, my 11th grade literature teacher. He could even make the most disinterested student want to please him and make good grades. He made it a personal mission to know each of his students and learn how to inspire them. He attended every sports game he could of the school, and you could always immediately recognize him because he would sport a suit that was made of school colors. You see, these teachers had invested themselves into their students, something that the system today not only doesn't do, but actively discourages. Our children have become non-thinking wards of the state, and part of the system that purposely indoctrinates them into becoming a part of a greater whole rather than celebrating them as individuals. Rather than promoting critical thinking, they are being taught critical race theory. Instead of being taught history, history is being rewritten. Individuality has been replaced with a hive mentality where we are replaceable parts who serve the purpose that has already been outlined for the most precious of all our commodities, which is our children and grandchildren. Now, as a side note, the Department of Education needs to be completely gone. The federal government has no constitutional authority to be involved in school curriculums. As Julie Borowski noted in a 2011 article she wrote for FreedomWorks, the Department of Education deserves to be on the chopping block. Our children's education is too important to be left up to federal centralized bureaucracies. See, Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education as a political payoff to the teachers' unions for their 1976 endorsement of his presidential bid. We should judge all governmental institutions and agencies by their results rather than their intentions. Like virtually every federal department, the Department of Education has only made things worse. Education for students' outcomes has worsened since the creation of the Department of Education. The federal government meddling in education has been a failure, to say the least. A group of federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. cannot possibly design a system or curriculum that meets the unique needs of millions of school children across the nation. We need to restore control over education at the local level where teachers and parents are put back in charge. Make no mistake, eliminating the Department of Education is a pro-education position. And finally, we have seen what happens when government is in charge of our children's education. You see, they believe that school systems have the right to tell children what to do and believe. I believe that parents should be in charge of their own children's education. As with most of the underlying themes of my videos, and this subject is, of course, no different, our children's education is about our freedoms, the freedom to mold our children into the young men and women we want them to be, to allow them the ability to express themselves as individuals. And finally, for us to have the choice to educate them in the manner we see fit, whatever that means, moving them to another public school, using vouchers to go to private schools, or to homeschool them. We should be the primary influences in our children's lives and not the government. Well, my independent-minded listeners, it has reached that time again. I have pontificated enough from on high, and it is time for me to sign off. As always, I hope you have enjoyed what I've covered today. If you have, please take the time to make comments, get notifications of new content, and most importantly, to hit that little subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner. Until next time, I'll be praying for you and this country. I hope you find peace and contentment in your lives, even amid all the uncertainty of our world these days. Goodbye, and God bless you and your families.